The rain had been falling steadily all afternoon, soaking the city in a gray stillness that mirrored Ethan Grant's mood as he left his final meeting of the day. It was nearly 9 p.m. The lobby of Grant Holdings was quiet, the kind of corporate silence that lingered after everyone else had gone home. Ethan liked it that way. Quiet meant control, and control was the only thing that kept his life in order. But that night, something unexpected disrupted the calm. Just beyond the glass doors where the streetlights barely reached, a small figure sat curled beneath the company sign. At first, Ethan thought it was a stray animal, but as he stepped closer, he realized it was a child, a little girl, no more than 7 or 8, soaked to the skin, her thin dress clinging to her frame, her hair plastered to her forehead. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and glassy. There was no fear in her expression, just exhaustion and something else he couldn't quite name. Compassion? Desperation? Ethan hesitated. He wasn't good with children. He didn't even like being around them. But the girl didn't ask for much. She simply whispered almost inaudibly, "Please help her." And then without warning, her body went limp. Instinct overrode logic. Ethan knelt down, lifted her carefully into his arms, and rushed to his car, barking orders into his phone for his driver to prepare for the hospital. The girl was light, far too light. She didn't stir once during the ride, and Ethan found himself glancing at her face more than he expected, trying to understand what had just happened. He didn't know her name. He didn't know who her was. But for the first time in years, he felt something break through the steel wall he'd spent so long building around himself. At the hospital, nurses rushed to take her in. Ethan stood awkwardly in the waiting room, still in his tailored suit, damp from the rain. It was only then that he noticed her hands, bruised, rough, and small, had been clutching a crumpled piece of paper. A name and address were barely legible in smeared ink. He handed it to the nurse, not yet knowing that that paper would soon lead him to someone who would change the course of his life. As he waited, listening to the steady rhythm of monitors and the occasional distant cry, Ethan felt the weight of something unfamiliar pressing on his chest. Guilt? Concern? Or was it something deeper? A faint, long-forgotten ache he'd spent years ignoring. He didn't know. All he knew was that he couldn't just walk away. Not this time. Morning arrived pale and muted, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Ethan hadn't left the hospital all night. He sat in the corner of the pediatric waiting room, his suit wrinkled, his tie loosened, coffee gone cold in his hand. For years he had lived by a code of precision. Meetings on time, decisions made quickly, emotions kept in check. But nothing about this situation fit within those boundaries. The doctor finally approached just after sunrise. "She's stable now," she said gently. "Severe exhaustion, dehydration, and signs of long-term malnutrition. She hasn't spoken since regaining consciousness." Ethan nodded, unsure what response was appropriate. "Does she have a name?" "She wrote it down for the nurse. Lily." The doctor paused, her expression tightening. "There's no record of a legal guardian, just that paper you gave us." Ethan felt a flicker of something, dread maybe, or anticipation. He asked for the address. An hour later, he found himself standing in front of a rundown building in a forgotten corner of the city. The kind of place he'd spent decades trying to rise above. A rusted mailbox bore the same name from the note, Maria T. Alvarez. The door was already slightly open. Inside, the air was thick with dampness and old wood. A single beam of sunlight filtered through cracked blinds, falling across a woman curled on a worn mattress in the corner. She stirred weakly when Ethan stepped inside. Thin, pale, and far too young to look so worn down, she barely had the strength to lift her head. "Are you Maria?" he asked, his voice more hesitant than he expected. She nodded. "Where's Lily?" Her voice cracked, raw and strained. "Is she okay?" "She's safe," Ethan said. She came to my office, passed out right in front of me. Maria closed her eyes, relief washing over her features like a wave. I told her not to go, but I couldn't stop her. I thought I was dying. You almost did, Ethan said bluntly. Why didn't you go to a hospital? Couldn't afford it. Couldn't risk losing Lily to the system. I've kept us off the grid for years. No papers, no help. Her breathing was shallow, her words slow. All I ever wanted was to keep her safe. Ethan didn't respond right away. Part of him wanted to walk away. This wasn't his responsibility. He had an empire to run, shareholders to answer to, a reputation built on being ruthless and emotionally untouchable. But another part, a deeper, quieter part, couldn't forget the way Lily had looked at him. Trusting, fragile, brave. Maria reached into a nearby bag and pulled out a photo, creased, almost torn in half. It showed her and Lily, years earlier, smiling in front of a piano. She's gifted, Maria whispered. I taught her everything I knew. If I don't make it, please, don't let her end up like me. The room was silent for a moment. Ethan looked at the photo, then at the woman fading before him, and finally at the broken piano in the corner of the room. Something in him cracked, not loudly but deeply. He didn't say yes, not yet, but he also didn't say no. When he returned to the hospital, Lily was awake. She sat up in bed, quiet, hugging her knees. Ethan stepped into the room and she looked up with wide, uncertain eyes. She's still alive, he said gently. She asked me to check on you. Lily didn't answer. She just nodded and turned her face toward the window. The sun was fully up now, casting light into the sterile white of the room. Ethan stood there for a while, unsure what to do next. What he didn't know was that his life had already begun to change. Ethan returned the next day, carrying a paper bag with warm food and a set of clean clothes for Lily. He didn't know what children like to eat. He'd instructed his assistant to find something comforting, though he had no idea what that meant. He didn't expect Lily to say much. She hadn't spoken since that night outside his office. But when he walked into her hospital room, he found her sitting up, holding the photo Maria had given him. Is she going to die? Lily asked without looking up. The question hit harder than he anticipated. Her voice was small, almost detached, as if she'd rehearsed that sentence so many times that the words no longer carried emotion. Ethan sat down beside the bed, keeping a careful distance. She's very sick, he said honestly, but the doctors are doing everything they can. Lily finally met his gaze. If she does, will they take me away? Ethan paused. He wasn't a man used to being caught off guard, but everything about this girl, her quiet strength and the weight in her eyes, left him unsteady. I don't know, he admitted, but I won't let that happen without trying to help. She nodded once, then turned back to the window. Later that day, Maria was transferred to the ICU. Ethan stood just outside the glass wall, watching her sleep. Machines beeped rhythmically around her frail frame. The doctors had told him it was a combination of untreated pneumonia, chronic anemia, and years of physical strain. She had refused medical attention for too long. He didn't know why it mattered so much to him. Maria was a stranger. Lily wasn't his responsibility, and yet he couldn't leave. Something about Maria's soft, slurred voice when she spoke of her daughter, the way her words were laced with pride and pain, stayed with him. When she woke briefly, she motioned for him to come closer. Her voice was thinner than before. Each breath labored. You said, you were an orphan too, she whispered. He stiffened. Who told you that? Lily said, she saw a photo of you in the newspaper. Said you looked like someone who knew what it's like to be alone. He didn't answer. He hadn't talked about his past in years. Not to anyone. I don't need charity, Maria murmured. But if I don't survive, Don't let them take her. She doesn't belong in the system. She's gentle. She needs music, not chaos. She needs stability, Ethan said quietly. She needs someone who will see her, Maria replied, her voice so faint he had to lean in. Really see her. He stayed with her until the nurse asked him to leave. On the way out, he walked past the hospital chapel without thinking, and for reasons he couldn't explain, he stepped inside. It was quiet, dimly lit by stained glass. He sat in the back row alone. For years, Ethan had believed in control, power, precision, decisions backed by logic. He'd built an empire with that mindset, but sitting there in silence, with a dying mother in one room and a child with no one in another, logic felt meaningless. He closed his eyes and didn't pray. He wouldn't know how, but he sat with the heaviness, the discomfort, the sharp sting of memory that came unbidden. The orphanage, the nights he waited by the door, hoping someone would come for him. The silence when no one did. That night he returned to his penthouse. The lights flickered on automatically. Everything was in order. The air was cool, the furniture spotless, the kitchen unused. But the silence felt different now. It wasn't peaceful. It was hollow. He stood in the middle of his living room, holding the crumpled photo Lily had dropped, and realized for the first time in years, he didn't want to be alone. The next morning, Ethan made a decision that unsettled even him. He had his driver reroute to the hospital, not his office. No calendar alerts, no board meetings, just the quiet, deliberate choice to show up. When he entered Lily's room, she was dressed and sitting upright, her small hands folded neatly in her lap, like she had prepared herself for something serious. "Your mom's still holding on," he said, setting a small bag of pastries on the table. "She asked me to look after you for a little while, just until she gets better." Lily didn't react. She studied him, her expression unreadable. Then she gave a small nod, just once. Within hours, Ethan found himself buckling her into the back seat of his town car. The child said nothing during the ride. She simply stared out the window, her reflection lost in the blur of passing buildings. Ethan couldn't help but notice how quiet she was, unnaturally quiet, like someone taught not to ask for too much. When they arrived at his home, a sleek, glass-walled penthouse atop one of the tallest towers in the city, Lily hesitated in the lobby. Her shoes squeaked slightly against the marble floors. She looked up at the elevator, then back at Ethan. "Do I take my shoes off here?" she asked softly. It was such a simple question, yet it landed in his chest like a stone. "No," he said gently. "Not unless you want to." The apartment was immaculate, curated to impress, modern art on the walls, furniture so clean it barely looked touched. But as they stepped inside, the silence felt too large. The kind of silence that filled spaces where no one laughed, where no one lived, only existed. Lily stood near the doorway, clutching her small backpack, unsure where to go. Ethan cleared his throat and motioned toward the hallway. "There's a guest room. We'll make sure it has everything you need." Later, while she unpacked in silence, Ethan found himself pacing the kitchen, opening and closing cabinets as if searching for something. Eventually, he settled on making grilled cheese, the only thing he remembered how to cook. He hadn't made one since college. She ate without complaint, carefully, quietly. Halfway through the sandwich, she paused. "This is really good," she said. He looked up, surprised. It was the first time he'd heard anything resembling joy in her voice. That night, Ethan stood outside her room, listening to her move about. Soft footsteps, the rustle of sheets. Then, silence. He didn't know what he expected, but he stood there longer than he meant to. When he returned to his own room, he found himself unable to sleep. He walked through the darkened hallway, past the kitchen, and into a room he hadn't entered in years, the music room. It had belonged to his mother once, before she left, before everything else. The piano still stood in the corner, untouched, covered with a white cloth like a forgotten relic. On impulse, Ethan pulled the cloth back. Dust rose in the air. He sat down on the bench and pressed a single key. The note rang out, soft, haunting. The next morning he awoke to the sound of music. Lily was sitting at the piano, barefoot in one of his oversized t-shirts, playing with gentle fingers. The melody was fragile but intentional, something simple, childlike. Ethan watched from the hallway, unseen, as she lost herself in the sound. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and for the first time in years, his home didn't feel like a fortress. It felt like something was waking up inside it, and perhaps inside him too. Ethan wasn't sure how long he stood in the hallway, watching Lily at the piano. Her small fingers danced across the keys with instinct more than training. She didn't look at sheet music. She didn't hesitate. Her body moved with a quiet familiarity, as if the piano was the only place she truly belonged. When she finally noticed him, she froze. "I'm sorry," she whispered, slipping off the bench. "I didn't mean to touch anything. I saw it yesterday and You can play," he interrupted, walking slowly into the room. "Anytime. That piano's been silent for too long." She glanced at him, unsure. Then after a moment, she nodded. They didn't speak much after that. Ethan returned to his work, or tried to. He brought his laptop into the dining room and took calls from there, half listening as Lily's music drifted softly through the halls. There was something strangely comforting about it. The melodies were never loud or demanding, just soft notes played again and again, as if she was searching for something she'd forgotten. That night after dinner, she sat across from him with a sketch pad in her lap. He didn't ask what she was drawing. He simply poured her a glass of milk and slid it across the table. "You play well," he said finally. "My mom taught me," she replied. "She used to say music was a safe place, even when everything else wasn't." Ethan nodded slowly. He understood that. Too well. She glanced up at him. "Did you have a mom?" He hesitated. "I did. She left when I was young." "Why?" He stared at the glass in his hand. "I used to think it was because I wasn't enough." Lily's brow furrowed. "That's not fair." "No," he said quietly. "It wasn't." They didn't say much after that, but something shifted between them. Not trust, not yet, but a kind of understanding, a mutual recognition of what it meant to be left behind. Over the next few days, a rhythm emerged. Ethan began coming home earlier. He found himself lingering in the kitchen, asking Lily about schoolwork, though she hadn't been enrolled anywhere yet, and listening to her play. He brought home sheet music, music books, even asked his assistant to find a private teacher. But Lily always returned to the old familiar pieces her mother taught her, the ones with no names, only emotion. One evening, as Ethan worked in his office, he heard a change in her playing. It wasn't soft or slow. It was tense. Notes clashing, building, breaking. He walked to the music room and found her crying, her face turned away, her hands still on the keys. He didn't say anything, just sat beside her. "Is she going to die?" she asked again, but this time it wasn't quiet. It was angry. "I don't know," Ethan said truthfully. "She's the only person who ever loved me. What if she goes and I forget her voice, or her smell, or how her hands felt when she braided my hair?" "You won't forget," he said. "It'll stay with you, just in different ways." Lily looked down at her hands. "Then why does it already feel like I'm losing her?" Ethan had no answer. All he could do was sit beside her in the silence, while the piano echoed the sound of everything they couldn't say out loud. And in that shared silence, a thread began to form between them. Delicate, unspoken, but real. Something that neither money nor words could buy. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was the beginning. Monday came, and with it, the sharp return of Ethan's professional life. His assistant waited in the town car with a stack of folders, And by the time he entered the boardroom on the top floor of Grand Holdings, the polished steel and glass felt colder than usual. Executives shuffled notes, discussed quarterly projections, and glanced his way with the usual calculated deference. But Ethan wasn't listening. His mind kept returning to the image of Lily in the music room, hair unbrushed, humming to herself as she played a piece her mother had once written. Her voice was soft, but the weight behind it was heavy. She was still grieving, still waiting for news that might never come. In the meeting, someone mentioned a land acquisition deal, an opportunity that would level several old buildings, including a community music center in the lower district. "Rejected," Ethan said abruptly. Heads turned. Confused silence followed. "Sir, pull the proposal. We're not touching the community center." "But it's a prime." "I said no." That was all. No further explanation. He closed the folder in front of him and left the room. Back home that evening, Lily was waiting with a drawing in her hand. It showed Ethan's piano, but it wasn't empty. In her sketch, the bench held two figures, herself and another, less defined shape beside her. It wasn't quite Ethan. It wasn't her mother either. Just someone who stayed. "I made this," she said, holding it out. He took it gently, unsure what to say. "Thank you." She hesitated, then asked, "Can I go outside tomorrow?" Ethan blinked. "Outside? There's a park. I saw it from the window. I don't need to talk to anyone. I just want to feel the air." The request was so simple, so reasonable, yet it caught him off guard. This building, this life, had always been about protection. Walls, gates, locked doors. But Lily wasn't meant for walls. He saw it clearly now. She wasn't fragile, just tired of holding everything in. The next afternoon he took her. It was a modest park tucked between buildings, with a rusted swing set and a worn path looped around a patch of wild grass. Lily didn't run. She didn't shout or climb like other children. She just walked slowly, breathing deeply, like someone returning to a place they'd missed. Ethan sat on a bench nearby, keeping his phone off for once. She wandered toward a small sandbox and crouched beside a boy about her age, who was building a crooked tower of sticks and leaves. They didn't speak, but after a few minutes, they worked side by side in quiet coordination. No introductions, no awkwardness. Just two kids who understood the need for stillness. Watching them, Ethan felt something stir deep inside him. A memory maybe, or a regret. He'd never had that growing up. No quiet companions, no sandbox conversations, just rooms full of strangers and rules no one explained. Later on the walk home, Lily surprised him. "Do you think she'll ever get to see me play again?" she asked, eyes on the sidewalk. He didn't lie. "I hope so," she nodded. "I think, she'd be happy I'm here." Ethan looked down at her, this strange, wise little girl who had wandered into his world and turned it inside out, and realized he was starting to hope, too. Not just for Maria's survival, but for something else, something he never let himself want, a second chance at something real. Maria Alvarez had never been a woman who asked for help. Life had taught her not to. But as the days blurred in the hospital and the machines buzzed quietly beside her bed, she began to understand that sometimes strength meant letting go. She was tired now, bone tired, breath tired. Each inhale felt borrowed. Her hands, once graceful on a piano, trembled even when still. But when Ethan entered her hospital room that afternoon, she managed a faint smile. "You came again," she said. He nodded, pulling a chair closer. "Lily asked me to. She's adjusting. She plays the piano every morning," he said. "Sometimes late at night. She likes the quiet hours." Maria let out a shaky breath, part laugh, part sigh. "She always did. She was a quiet baby, too. People thought she couldn't speak, but she just listened." "She still listens," Ethan said. "To everything." Maria's eyes closed for a moment, and when she opened them again, They glistened. "Do you know the last thing I told her before I sent her to you?" He shook his head. "I told her that if someone opened the door, it meant they still had a heart, and she should trust that." Ethan didn't know what to say. His throat tightened, and for a moment, he wasn't a CEO, wasn't a man of control or numbers. He was just someone sitting in a quiet room with a dying woman who had given him more than she ever knew. "She's going to need someone," Maria said. Her voice was firm despite the weakness in her body. "Not just for shelter, not just for food, but for the days she doesn't know how to cry and the nights when she forgets to be brave." He nodded slowly. "I know. I'm not asking for pity. I'm not even asking for a promise," she said, her eyes locking onto his. "I'm asking for truth. Will you let her matter to you?" That question cut deeper than any deal Ethan had ever negotiated. "Yes," he said after a long pause. "She already does." Maria closed her eyes again, as if that answer allowed her to finally rest. The nurse adjusted her IV drip, but Maria didn't stir. Her breath had become a slow tide in and out, fragile but peaceful. Later, as Ethan walked out of the room, he passed a piano in the hospital's physical therapy wing. It sat unused, its keys chipped, the wood scuffed from years of service. On impulse, he sat down. He hadn't played since he was 13. His fingers hovered over the keys, unsure. Then he pressed one note, then another, a minor chord, a third. It was raw and imperfect, but it came out real. People passed behind him, barely noticing the man in the expensive coat playing a broken piano, but he didn't care. Back at the penthouse, Lily waited by the window, her knees pulled to her chest. When Ethan returned, she didn't ask questions. She just looked up at him. "She's not coming home, is she?" He knelt down in front of her. "Not to that home? No?" Lily didn't cry. Not then. She simply leaned forward and rested her forehead against his chest. And for the first time, Ethan didn't freeze. He placed a hand gently on the back of her head and held her there. In the silence of that moment, something passed between them. Not spoken, not explained, just shared. A beginning and an end. The funeral was simple. Maria had no family, no church, no estate, only a daughter and a handful of worn piano sheets she had composed by hand. Ethan arranged everything quietly. He didn't want press attention or curious investors wondering why the CEO of Grant Holdings stood alone in a cemetery beside a little girl in black shoes, too big for her feet. Lily held one of her mother's music pages close to her chest as they lowered the casket. She didn't cry. She just stared, her face pale with restraint, her small fingers curled tightly around the edges of the paper. Ethan stood behind her, unsure whether to touch her shoulder or let her be. In the end, he didn't speak. He just stayed, still and silent as the wind moved through the trees. Afterward, he took her home. Not to the hospital, not to a shelter, to his home. Something had shifted between them, unspoken but undeniable. It wasn't just that Maria was gone. It was the way Lily had slipped her hand into his at the gravesite, like a quiet question she didn't know how to ask. That night she didn't want music. She didn't want food. She just wanted the old sweater of her mother's that the nurse had saved in a plastic bag. She curled into it on the couch and sat in silence, eyes half closed. Ethan joined her hours later, a blanket in his hands. He draped it over her gently. "Do I have to go somewhere else now?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. "No," he said. "Are you going to send me to live with strangers?" "No." She turned slightly toward him. "Then what happens to me now?" He didn't answer right away, because the truth was he didn't know what he was doing. He hadn't planned any of this. There were lawyers to call, papers to file, background checks, social services, but none of that mattered in that moment. "I think," he said slowly, "you stay here, with me, for as long as you want." She blinked. Even if I make mistakes? Yes. Even if I'm not quiet all the time? Yes. A long silence passed between them. Then she nodded and laid her head against the armrest, her small frame sinking deeper into the couch, her eyes finally closing. Over the following weeks, life began to reshape itself. Ethan's days changed, not in sweeping, dramatic ways, but in the rhythm of small things. Mornings began with Lily padding into the kitchen in her socks, asking about scrambled eggs. Evenings included piano, laughter, and sometimes awkward homework questions he hadn't thought about in decades. He started keeping his phone face down. He started saying no to late meetings and yes to evening walks. He enrolled Lily in a private school, not the cold, uptight kind his board members' children attended, but a smaller one where teachers remembered every student's name and let them paint music on walls. But grief wasn't linear, and Lily's healing didn't follow a script. Sometimes she would sit at the piano and stare at the keys without playing. Other times she would ask questions Ethan couldn't answer. Why did she get sick? Why do good people go away? Do you think she's watching me? He never pretended to know more than he did. He just answered with what felt true. I don't know why, he said once, but I think she'd be proud of you. And I think, if she could choose where to be, she'd be right here. On the day Lily asked if she could call him something else, not Mr. Grant, not Sir, just Ethan, he smiled and said yes. But the day she tried out Dad for the first time, testing it like a fragile note in a new melody, he didn't smile. He just said, yeah, that sounds right. And for the first time since his own mother left him at a foster home door, Ethan Grant didn't feel like a man who had everything to lose. He felt like someone who'd just begun to gain everything he never thought he deserved. Ethan Grant had once believed redemption came in grand gestures, in donations and foundations, in skyscrapers bearing his name. But in the months following Maria's death, he learned that real change whispered through the unnoticed corners of daily life. It was in packing Lily's lunch each morning, careful to cut the crust off her sandwiches the way she liked. It was in learning her favorite composers and sitting beside her during piano practice, not to correct, but simply to listen. It was in leaving work early, not because of emergencies, but because she had a recital, or just wanted to show him something she built with Legos. The man who once measured life in contracts and quarterly gains now counted time in shared breakfasts, late-night conversations, and laughter that drifted down the hall after bedtime. But Ethan didn't stop there. One rainy afternoon, while waiting in the car outside Lily's school, he saw a boy standing alone under a broken umbrella. The look on the boy's face, the same quiet, forgotten expression he had seen on his own face as a child, didn't leave him. The next day, he met with his board and announced a new initiative. Grant Holdings would launch a citywide program to renovate underfunded art schools, music centers, and after-school programs for at-risk youth. Some executives protested, "It's not profitable. It doesn't align with our investment strategy." But Ethan's voice was calm and clear. "We've invested in enough buildings. It's time we invest in people." Over the following weeks, he made personal visits to each location the company funded. He met single mothers who reminded him of Maria, boys who flinched at loud noises, girls who clung to sketchbooks like lifelines. He didn't bring a press team. He brought his time. He listened. At one center, a teacher showed him a room full of broken instruments and outdated sheet music. Ethan asked what they needed most. "Hope," the teacher said, "but we'd settle for working violins." He sent them 20 new ones the next day, along with 5 new instructors. Back at home, Lily began to flourish. Her grief remained, but it no longer defined her. She filled the apartment with color, drawings taped to the fridge, music scribbled in her notebook, questions about the stars and why some people leave and others stay. One evening, Ethan came home to find her waiting with something behind her back. She pulled out a folded piece of paper, a handwritten song titled For my mom with love. I want to play this at the spring concert, she said. I wrote it, but I want you to hear it first. Sir. He sat beside the piano as she played. The music was soft and uncertain at first, then grew stronger, fuller. Each note carried memory and longing, but also light. It was a goodbye and a beginning. When she finished, Ethan didn't speak. He only reached over and hugged her, tighter than words could ever manage. Later that night, as he watched Lily sleep, arms wrapped around a stuffed bear, hair tangled in her pillow, Ethan thought of the boy he used to be, the one who had waited by the door and believed no one was coming. And then he thought of the girl who had come, who had waited outside his office in the rain, asking not for herself, but for someone else. She hadn't just asked for help that night. She had saved him. Without knowing it, she had knocked on the door of a man who didn't believe in second chances and left it wide open. Spring came with early blossoms and gentle winds that carried both renewal and remembrance. The city felt warmer now, not just in weather, but in spirit. A quiet shift that mirrored the changes in Ethan and Lily's lives. The spring concert arrived on a soft April evening. The auditorium buzzed with quiet anticipation, parents fanning programs, children smoothing dresses and bow ties. Ethan sat near the front, a camera in his hand, nerves in his stomach. He hadn't felt this kind of anticipation in years, not for a merger, not for a speech, but for something far more delicate, something real. Lily walked onto the stage, small and poised in her pale blue dress, clutching the sheet music she had written. She sat at the grand piano, feet barely reaching the pedals, and for a second her eyes searched the crowd. She found him. He smiled and nodded, just once. That was enough. Her fingers touched the keys. The first note rang out, clear and tender, and the room fell into silence. The piece unfolded like memory, melancholy, full of ache, but layered with hope. Ethan heard Maria in the melody, her quiet strength, her fading breath, her love poured into this little girl. And he heard something else too, his own story buried in the chords, a man who had almost missed it all. When the final note faded, there was a stillness before the applause, as if the audience needed a breath before returning to the world. Then they clapped, parents, students, teachers. But Ethan didn't clap right away. He just wiped his eyes and whispered, "Thank you." After the concert, Lily ran into his arms. "Did I do okay?" she asked, breathless. "You did more than okay," he said. "You gave the world something it didn't know it needed." She grinned and buried her face in his coat. On the drive home, she asked quietly, "Do you think Mom heard it?" "I do," he said. "I think she hears everything." Life didn't magically become perfect after that. There were still hard days, school challenges, grief that resurfaced like sudden rain, and Ethan's constant struggle to balance work with fatherhood. But now there was intention and heart. He no longer moved through life alone. One weekend, as they were organizing a community piano drive, a soft knock came at their apartment door. Ethan opened it to find a woman in her 20s, holding a donation form and a hesitant smile. "Hi, I work with the new outreach center on 5th. Someone said you might want to help." He didn't hesitate. "Come in," he said. "Tell me what you need." That night, after Lily went to bed, he stood at the window looking out over the city. Lights flickered like stars, and the wind pushed faint laughter from the streets below. He thought of Maria, of the girl outside his office, of the moment he almost turned away, and he made himself a quiet promise. The door will always stay open. No matter who knock,